Hello, everybody. We are going to do this Module 5 exam review. Take care of that today. Hang on just a minute. I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. Alrighty, so let's get started here. We are, like I said, we're going to do the Module 5 exam review. And I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm not trying to make things harder or anything like that, but we're going to come over here and I've added some different, let me see, share my screen. I've added a couple different little, excuse me, worksheets to our Module 5. And I'm going to go over those that are kind of more specific to Mod 5. And then I'm going to do a separate, completely separate final exam review. That'll be a part of this. So. Okay. So if you go to your home here, and remember we're looking for Module 5, so pull up Module 5. I have added a couple little things down here close to the bottom. I've added these ambulance operations, MCI triage, hazmat, and medical legal. Okay. So the first thing we're going to go over is this medical legal. Right. And this will cover some pretty good stuff that will, I know we had you guys do medical legal earlier in the course because you need to have the information and just realize, you know, what the parameters are for us to be working within. But definitely going to hit it a little bit harder to make sure everyone is good with consent and some of the rules and regulations that we have to operate under. So medical legal. Alrighty. So the first things that we have on here is a couple definitions, right? We've got scope of practice, standards of care, duty to act, and negligence. So let's go over that. So your scope of practice, and I know you've heard me say this a lot in class, you know, make sure you're operating, you know, within your scope of practice. Like when you guys do your clinicals, make sure you're operating within your scope of practice as an EMT, okay? So the scope of practice are the actions and care that EMTs are allowed to perform by the state in which they work. We are here in the state of Texas, and so there's specific things for the state of Texas. Now, there is a national EMS scope of practice model. It's national that most states model their rules with, but technically each state could have a couple little differences here and there. Okay. But this is the actions and care that EMTs are allowed to perform by the state in which they work. These are state laws, regulations, and policies. And remember, the medical director is the one who delegates your responsibilities. Okay. So medical director is the individual who is ultimately responsible for delegating, your responsibilities in your scope of practice. Okay. Standards of care. This is the manner in which an EMT must act and behave. So the two questions that you have to ask yourself is, did you provide the right assessment and care? And did you provide that assessment and care properly? Those are the two big questions, okay? And that's the standard of care. You have your scope of practice, which is the parameters of which we're allowed to work, right? The actions and care that we're allowed to do. And then the standards of care is, did you do it right? And did you do it properly? The duty to act, this is your legal obligation to provide service, okay? Your legal obligation to provide service. When you are on shift and you're presented with someone who needs your help, someone who has requested your help, right? If they've called 911 or if they've had 911 called for them. So if someone else called 911, then you have a duty to act. Okay. And when you get on the scene, that duty falls with patient assessment, care, and all that good stuff. It does exist while you are on duty. You cannot refuse to respond to a call. Okay. It doesn't matter what time of the day it is. It doesn't matter if you're about to get off shift. You cannot refuse to respond to a call. If you are called, it is your duty to act to go to it. You also cannot refuse to provide care to a patient. So what does that mean? That means that if you get on scene and the person that you were called for is someone that you really don't want to help. Okay. Could this happen? Yeah. I mean, technically it could happen. We run DWI, vehicle accidents all the time. And if that person who unfortunately was the one who caused the accident, if they are hurt, they're still a patient. And so we have a duty to act to provide care, the appropriate care to that individual, right? What if it's someone who just committed a crime or did something or did something to someone else, and they are now hurt and needs our help. Sometimes it's really hard to look at that and look at that circumstance and be like, all right, okay, I got to do this, right? So every person, every call, you have a duty to act to provide the care to that individual. And then the standards of care is to provide it appropriately and correct. All right. Now, negligence kind of pops in there when we don't do what we're supposed to be doing. Okay. Negligence is going to be the failure to provide the same care that a person with similar training would provide in the same or similar situation. Okay. So across the state of Texas, we've got all of the EMT programs and all that kind of stuff, right? Most of the same curriculums and the same scope of practice, right? Because we've got the scope of practice by the state of Texas. Think about UEMR. Okay. Think about the program that you're a part of. Everybody who's going through this has the same training, the same, training and testing and evaluations that you do. And so that care, the care that person will provide is in a similar situation is the same that you would provide, right? So that's kind of what negligence stands up to, if you will, right? So negligence would be the failure to provide the same care that a person with similar training would provide in the same or similar situation. So there are 4 very specific factors in negligence. In order for someone to be found truly negligent, the first one is there was a duty to act, right? That duty to act existed. The second is there was a breach of that duty to act. Okay, there was a breach of it, so it wasn't done, right? The third is the patient suffered harm or injury. And then the fourth piece of negligence is that injury was the result of the breach of the duty. Okay, so it has to be proven that your breach of your duty is the reason why that patient was injured or suffered harm. Okay, and that's what we call proximate cause. So negligence is it's not a loose term that we throw around. Okay, but it's definitely something to take serious. Okay, you may not have an intent to do harm, but if you didn't do something appropriate, or you didn't do what you were supposed to do, and the patient suffered harm specifically from that could be from negligence. Okay, that could be actually identified as negligence. Okay, so really important to know those. Now, the Good Samaritan law, and I think we've talked about this a little bit when we were going over BLS and stuff at the beginning of the course. But the Good Samaritan law is it's something that will protect a person who is not being paid for his or her services. So normally this is going to be someone who is off duty. It protects them from liability for acts performed in good faith. Okay, except in cases of gross negligence, and gross negligence is we can talk about that later. But basically, someone who is trying to help is not on duty, so they don't have a duty to act. Okay, because they're not on shift, but they're trying to help, and their acts are performed in good faith. Okay, so you need to render care to the best of your ability, act professionally, and try to take care of that patient. Those Good Samaritan laws will protect you, okay, from that liability. Okay, consent. This is extremely important because everything that we do falls back to consent. Did we have consent to do the things we did, right? So far, we've been talking about all of the, the assessment and what do we do, the interventions and all the things that we can do for our patients. But you have to have consent in order to do that, right? And so there's different kinds of consent, and they exist within different circumstances, and that's what this is going to go over. Because we've got informed consent, expressed consent, implied, and then involuntary. So informed consent is very specific. It's when you have explained what's going on. You've talked about the treatment, the risks, the benefits, the consequences of refusing. The patient has to have the facts in order to know what they are consenting to. So they are informed of the facts of what they're consenting to. Okay, that's going to be informed consent. Okay. Expressed consent is given when the patient acknowledges that he or she wants you to provide care and transport. Okay, most of the time we operate under expressed consent. When someone calls 911, you walk in. Hi, my name's Stephanie. I'm an EMT. Here to see what you need. Can I go ahead and take your blood pressure? Can I go ahead and do you mind if I feel your skin? So they're acknowledging that he or she wants you to provide care. That acknowledgement can come from a verbal or a nonverbal acknowledgement, right? So they could nod their head, yes or no, okay? Or they can actually physically say yes, right? So it's either speech or other means, but you are given that expressed consent that the patient wants you to provide care and wants you to provide transport. Now, this person obviously has to be mentally competent, okay? And so the question from that is, well, what is a mentally competent patient? So the mental capacity of your patient is very, very important when we're trying to decide, are they capable of making decisions, okay? Can your patient understand and process the information that you're providing in order to make decisions about their care? Okay, so they need to be mentally competent in order to give you that expressed consent. And a lot of times you guys are looking for mental competency through your orientation questions. Do you know who you are? Do you know where you're at? That kind of stuff. But sometimes you have to actually have a little bit more of a conversation with somebody, okay? And the reason I say this is you can have someone who has ingested toxins, maybe illicit drugs or alcohol or something like that. And if you ask them who they are, where they're at, who the president is, and how many quarters are in a dollar, I can guarantee you they can tell you those answers, right? And they might be 3 sheets to the wind, but they can still express that information to you. And then you're going off the fact that, okay, they're awake, they're oriented, they can make good mental they're mentally competent to make decisions. Well, sometimes you have to have a conversation with these individuals because they are not mentally competent at all. Even though they can answer those 4 simple questions, they're not competent to make decisions, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. Implied consent, this is when the patient is unconscious or they are incapable of making an informed decision, okay? The law assumes that the patient or any reasonable person would consent to care and transport in this situation. Okay, so it's implied that this person would want you to care for them. Okay, so the patient is unconscious, altered. They might be a minor. This is where the consent to treat and care for kids comes in. It's under implied consent, used most of the time in life-threatening situations. But this is going to be, this person can't make decisions for themselves, whether they're unconscious, altered, not capable of making those decisions. Maybe they have Alzheimer's or dementia, or they're a minor. And so I'm making the decision for them. We are, and we're taking care of this person, because the law views this as any reasonable person would want care in this situation. That is implied consent. And involuntary consent is a little bit different, because normally you have an adult in this situation. And this is mostly common for your patients who are mentally ill or who are experiencing behavioral crises. Most of the time, this consent is granted by a court system or by law enforcement if the patient is in their custody. So that involuntary consent is going to be, it doesn't really matter what the patient says. They are not mentally, they've been found mentally incompetent or not able to make decisions for themselves. And so the court is going to make that decision, or law enforcement is going to make that decision. So it's considered involuntary consent. Okay, so understanding those, that's really important. Most of the time, like I said, we operate under expressed consent, because we get on scene and the person, wants us there and wants us to care for them, right? Implied consent is going to be if they're altered, unconscious, a minor, someone who cannot give us their consent. And then involuntary consent, sometimes you may run into this if you're, like I said, maybe doing a transfer from one facility to the next with a court order, or if, law enforcement calls you out there and they have that patient in their custody. And that would be considered involuntary consent. So what type of consent does EMS require to treat children? Well, that goes right back to that implied consent, okay? So first off, you want to get consent from their guardian or their caregiver, okay? That's really what you want. But if they are unreachable, or or you can't get a hold of them, then we operate under that implied consent, okay? But if I'm, if I'm on scene and my son is hurt, my son who's 13, almost 14, if he's hurt, then you're going to get consent from me to treat and care for my son. But if he's, if I'm not around, or my husband's not around, and y'all can't get a hold of me for whatever reason, then my son is in real a life threat, a danger to his life, then you guys are gonna act, right? Because remember, implied consent is any reasonable person would want to receive care, or in this situation would want their child to receive care. Okay. Who is actually able to give consent for a child? That's a great question. So first off, the parent. That's super simple, right? The parent is probably one of the first ones that we would go to. But after that, you have legal guardian. You can have grandparents can give consent. You can have the school, right? So if this kiddo is at school, I don't know if you guys are aware of this or not. Excuse me. Or if you have, if you have kids, and you probably had to fill out this paperwork. But when you enroll your child in an institution, a school, right, an academic institution, they have you fill out a lot of paperwork. Okay, and it's there's a lot of questions about if your child gets hurt. They want to know who needs to be called, in what order, if this person is not reachable, who else, and that kind of stuff. But then they also have, if you aren't able to be reached, what hospital do you want your child to be transported to? They want to know, do they have a primary care physician? And they want to know a lot of that information, because technically, if the school is unable to get a hold of you, then the school is going to have to make a decision, right? And so that academic institution will be able to give consent for that kiddo if something happens while they're at school. Law enforcement also can give consent for a child if they've placed that child in their custody. You can also have individuals that have like a confirmed written consent by the parents. So every once in a while, it's not often, but if someone's babysitting and something happens, you get there and you have an 18 or 19-year-old who is not related to this person at all, or is not related to the child at all, and they're, I don't know, maybe they're sick, maybe their stomach hurts or something like that, right? And you can't get a hold of the parents, but the parents have given written consent. So there's a note or some kind of document saying that they give the babysitter the authority to make that decision. Then we can honor that as well, right? Of course, we would always try to get a hold of the parents, but if you couldn't, then you would have to honor that. So number 4, why can a minor not refuse care from EMS? So you notice there's a lot of questions about minors, and that's because it gets, kids get hurt, kids get sick, and we have to be able to, we have to know how to operate when we're around these kiddos, not just how to care for them and all that kind of stuff, but are we allowed to? So there's a lot of questions when it comes to kids. So number 4, why can they not refuse care? Well, because a minor is considered anyone under the age of 18. Okay, medically, a minor is anyone under the age of 18. Okay, those individuals, they don't have the maturity and judgment to truly understand what's going on, what's happening, in order to make an informed decision. Okay, so I'm sure in your book you've heard, they have to be able to make an informed decision, right? And that's when we explain everything and they know what's going on, and then they give their expressed consent. Well, a minor doesn't have the proper maturity of their brain, right, to truly understand what's happening in the situation. So that's why the minor cannot consent for themselves. Okay, they cannot consent, nor can they refuse care. They just can't make those decisions because they're not mature enough. Okay. What is an advance directive? So an advance directive is going to be a written document that specifies medical treatment for a competent patient if he or she is unable to make decisions. Okay, so this is for a patient who is normally competent, but if they are not able to make decisions on their own. So if something happens and they're no longer competent, it's a directive to us on their specific wishes for what they want to happen. Okay. You have different kinds of advanced directives. A DNR is a very specific kind of advanced directive. Okay, and we'll go over that in just a minute. But let me see here. What are some other forms of advanced directives? My brain is just kind of pausing right now. Let's see. If I can spell. Oh, that's right. Medical power of attorney. Okay. So that is going to be the most common type of advanced directive, is what's called the medical power of attorney. So you're going to get on scene of several, you're going to have a lot of calls where you get on scene. Maybe you have an older patient that's, your patient is actually someone up in their senior years, and maybe their son or daughter is on scene. And their son or daughter tells you, well, I have power of attorney, so I'm going to make the decision, and this is what I want to happen. But a lot of times what they don't understand is that power of attorney is only if the patient is not able to make the decision themselves. Okay. So if the patient is competent and you know how to, decide if someone is competent or not, ask them your questions, have a conversation with them. Are they capable of making, decisions about their care, right? You have to figure out their competency, because you can't just have this piece of paper that the son or daughter says, I've got power of attorney, so I don't care what they want to do. This is what I want to do. And that's really not how that works. That power of attorney only comes into play when the patient is not able to make decisions on their own. Okay. So that's really important. You're going to run into that a lot. There's just this miscommunication, misunderstanding of a lot of family members. They don't understand what that power of attorney is. You have the out of hospital, do not resuscitate, the DNR, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. You've got living wills. A living will is considered an advance directive. Most of the time, that's a document that's typed up and written up, kind of explaining the wishes of the patient, of what they want. So there's a lot. There's a lot of different things that you might come into contact with when you're out there. So just kind of, if you're ever handed a form, like a legal form, and someone says, "Oh, I can make decisions, for this person," then give it a look and make sure, because like I said, that medical power of attorney, it allows the patient to appoint someone to make medical decisions on their behalf if they are unable to. Okay. And the key piece of that is if they are unable to. Okay. So now let's talk about DNRs. First off, a DNR is your do not resuscitate, okay? And we would operate with an out-of-hospital DNR, okay? There are in-hospital DNRs, but of course, being EMS, that's pre-hospital, so that's not really our environment. But your out-of-hospital DNR, and I'll go over what that form actually looks like in just a minute. But this is, what makes it valid? Well, there has to be a couple things on there. There has to be a clear statement of the patient's problem. There has to be multiple signatures, okay? Signature of the patient, signature of the guardian, and it has to be signed by their PCP, okay? This is an absolute must. So let's actually pull up a DNR and take a look at it, okay? And just kind of keep in mind that a DNR, remember, this is do not resuscitate. So when you get on the scene, this is going to be a cardiac arrest call, right? When you get on this scene, adrenaline's going to be pumping. There's going to be, some high emotions and stuff like that, right? And you're going to be presented with this form, and you're going to need to know what it is and if it's filled out correctly. And as you can see, there's a lot that's on here, but we're going to walk through it real quick and make sure that you're comfortable with it. So first thing you notice is up in this top left-hand corner, you have the state of Texas, and it says stop, do not resuscitate. Okay. That figure, that state right there, that will be on every single one of these forms. Okay. This person's full legal name will be filled out up at the top with their date of birth and their gender, male or female, okay? That will be filled out on every single form because this is who the form is concerning. Then you have a couple different sections underneath. You have A, B, C, D, E, and then a little bit further down you have F, okay? So, and we're going to talk about all those different ones because only one of those should be filled out, okay? Not all of them, but only one. So let's talk about that real quick. Okay, so A, this is when the actual patient themselves fills it out for themselves, okay? So this would be, before they go into cardiac arrest and before they become altered or are in some, are no longer able to make these decisions, right? So a lot of times you're gonna have a patient who fills one of these forms out for themselves. So that's what A is. That's the declaration of the adult. And this is for an adult. I am competent. So this is first person, right? So I am competent, at least 18 years of age. I direct that none of the following resuscitative measures be initiated or continued for me. They will sign date, and print their name. Now there's 5 things that this DNR deals with, okay? When we talked about advanced directives earlier, those can be multiple things, but a DNR is only about 5 very specific things, okay? The first one is compressions, CPR. If you're handed an out-of-hospital DNR that's valid, we cannot do compressions. Okay. The next one, specific to EMTs, artificial ventilation. So that means you can't bag anybody. You can't assist their ventilations. You cannot use that BVM. Okay. It doesn't matter if they're in respiratory failure. It doesn't matter if they're not breathing at all. If they have a valid form, you've looked at it, it's valid, it's signed, it's good. We don't do that. Okay. Defibrillation. Right? Use of the AED when it's time to shock. We cannot defibrillate our patients. Another one is going to be advanced airway management. This is going to be a little bit more for your advanced EMTs and paramedics when we intubate people and put the tubes into their trachea so we can isolate their lungs and really breathe for them. But then I would also have to breathe with a BVM, right? So those kind of play together. And then pacing. Again, this is going to be a paramedic level skill, but those are the 5 different things. Pacing is when we put the pads on them and we're actually given a little zap of energy at the rate that we want their heart rate to be. So we're pacing their heart rate, right? So a DNR deals with CPR, compressions, right? Compressions, assisted ventilations, defibrillation, advanced airway management, and pacing. Those are the 5 very specific things that this form is about. Okay, so just make sure you're good with that. So again, up here at the top, we've got the patient's name, their date of birth, and their gender, male or female. If the person themselves filled it out prior to them going into arrest, of course, then it's going to be A. A will be filled out. B is going to be filled out by their guardian. Okay, and it says this is a declaration by the legal guardian agent, okay, which be like medical power of attorney, or a proxy on behalf of the adult person who is incompetent or otherwise incapable of communication. Okay, so the adult patient is not able to communicate this to them. Okay, and it says I am, and they're going to select what kind of relationship they are with this person, right? Power of attorney, legal guardian, or a proxy in the directive to the physicians. And it says based upon the known desires of the person or a determination of the best interest of this person, I direct that none of the following measures, okay, and it's the same 5 things. That person will sign, date, and print their name. So B would be filled out if the person cannot fill it out for themselves, okay, and they're using, and their guardian is making that decision for them. C is going to be filled out by a qualified relative, okay, and this is going to be if no one from B is available. So, if this person doesn't have a legal guardian or doesn't have someone already declared their medical power of attorney, so someone who cannot legally make decisions for them, then you can have someone called a qualified relative. So C would only be filled out if you have a qualified relative of the adult person who is now incompetent or otherwise incapable of communication, right? And again, what is your relationship to them? Spouse, adult child, parent, or a nearest living relative. And they're qualified to make this decision. Okay. So again, to my knowledge, the adult person is incompetent, otherwise mentally, physically incapable of communication, and is without someone who can make this decision for them. So that's when this is filled out. D is only filled out when this is by the physician. Okay, so this is a declaration by a physician based on this is specific, a directive to the physician by the patient. Okay, but the patient or person is now incompetent. Okay, so basically, go away. Basically, the physician knows the wishes of the person. They've had this conversation. They've discussed this before, right? And that physician knows that this patient doesn't want to have CPR, advanced airways, assisted ventilations, pacing, or defibrillation. They don't want any of that kind of stuff, right? So it says, I am the above noted person's attending physician, and I have They check either they've seen evidence of their previously issued directive, or they have observed the issuance before two witnesses in a non-verbal manner. Okay, so and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the physician is basically making the decision for the patient who is no longer able to, but they know that the patient wants this. So they'll sign, they'll date, they'll print their name, and they put their license number. E, this is the only time that you're dealing with a minor. Everything else, A, B, C, and D, are all about the adult. Okay, E is for a minor. Okay, declaration on behalf of the minor. I'm the minor's parent, legal guardian, or managing conservator. A physician has diagnosed the minor as suffering from a terminal or irreversible condition. Okay, so you can't just go out and get a DNR on your kids. Okay, they have to have been diagnosed with a terminal or irreversible condition. And that parent or guardian is now filling out this DNR for them. They sign, they date, they print their name. Okay. This needs to have witnesses. There are two witnesses, and it says see qualifications on the back. So let's see if we can pull up the witness. Where is it? Where is it? There it is, definitions. Qualified witness. So it tells you what the witnesses are. They have to be competent adults. They have to witness the competent adult making his or her signature in Section A, or the others, making their signatures in either of the other sections. Okay. Let's see here. Competent adult. At least one of the witnesses not be. So one of these people can't be related to the person. Right? Can't be the attending physician, can't have a claim on this person, on their estate, right? So honestly, I mean, like one of the witnesses has to be almost like a stranger or someone who is not involved with this family at all, okay? But the two witnesses, you've got a signature, date, print the name, signature, date, print the name. Will you know the circumstances of all the witnesses? No. But what you need to see is you need to see two signatures and filled out by two witnesses, okay? There is a place for a notary as well. Okay, signature and the seal. The seal will be right here. Again, if you look on the back, it does talk about when, let's see here, optionally, you can sign it in the presence of a notary instead of the two qualified witnesses. Okay, you can kind of take a look at that. But that needs to be filled out. Then the physician statement. This is an absolute. Okay, and it says, I'm the attending physician, and I know that this order exists. I note the existence of this order in the person's medical records, and I agree, and I direct healthcare professionals acting in an out-of-hospital setting, so pre-hospital, not to do the following things. And again, it's the 5 things. Okay, now F, which is this very, very last one, okay, and it's kind of down here by itself, because this is when you've got two physicians making a decision for a person who is no longer competent, can no longer make the decisions, and they don't know what their wishes are, right? So if you remember D up here, the doctor is that person, the patient's attending physician, and they've had a conversation with this person. They know that they want this DNR to be filled out. But what if you have someone who you don't know their wishes? And that's what this F is about. So we have two docs on behalf of the adult who is incompetent or unable to communicate and without someone to make the decisions for them. It says the person's specific wishes are unknown, but resuscitation measures are in reasonable medical judgment, and that's why we have two docs here, right? Considered ineffective or otherwise not in the best interest of the person. And so that's where this comes in. You've got the attending physician signature, they date, they print their name and their license, and then you have a second physician. Okay. And then down at the bottom, basically anyone who has signed above this line signs again down at the bottom. So there's kind of a lot that goes into a DNR, and when you're handed this, I mean, the easiest thing is when they hand it to you, the name is filled out at the top. A is filled out because the person, signed it themselves before, something happened and they went into arrest. And then you've got your witnesses and your signatures by your physician. It's pretty simple. But when A isn't filled out and you're kind of looking through this and you're going, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't look like I have all the right signatures. I'm not sure about this. If you're not sure, then you have to continue, right? You have to continue caring for your patient. So this DNR has to be proven valid in order to be honored. So if you're not sure, utilize your other resources on your scene. Okay. Talk to some of the other providers. Y'all take a look at it. But if it's not something you either feel comfortable with because it doesn't look like it's signed appropriately or it's not signed appropriately, then you have to manage your patient, right? Now, what if someone says they have a DNR, I just can't find it? Then you work your patient. You don't not do this like a double negative, but you have to provide resuscitative measures to a person if they're in cardiac arrest, unless the DNR is physically in your hand. Okay. If they say, oh yeah, we have a DNR, it's at my house, it's at the apartment. Well, I'm sorry, it's not here. I can't see it. I can't review it. So I have to provide care, right? It doesn't have to be an original. It can be a copy. That's totally fine. But you have to have a physical copy of it in your hands. You have to be able to see it and take it with you and basically turn it in with your paperwork because it proves why you didn't manage and start working this patient. Okay. All right. What if someone rips up the DNR in front of you? Well, then now you no longer have a DNR. So you have to work the patient. Okay. All right. So let's go back to this, which is not pulling up. Oh, there it is. There it is. Okay. So compare and contrast. An advance directive, we talked about this earlier, but the patient is no longer competent to make decisions regarding their care. And so this can be a number of things, right? But a DNR is very specific about the 5 things: compressions, assisted ventilations, defibrillation, advanced airway management, and pacing. You can still provide supportive care, okay? Nowhere on the DNR does it say you can't give oxygen. So can you still give oxygen by a non-rebreather? You absolutely can. So if your patient is, not breathing very well and hypoxic and cyanotic, you can still put them on O2, just as long as you're not assisting their ventilations. Okay, you can still provide supportive care to this person as long as it's not those 5 things of resuscitation. Okay. All right. Who has the ability to refuse care from EMS and under what circumstances? So we've chatted about this a little bit in previous modules, especially when we were talking about patients with suicidal ideations. But the answer to this question is they have to have the mental capacity to refuse. And they have to be able to make decisions. So you have to figure that out. You have to have a conversation with them and figure that out. Are they mentally capable to make decisions, right? They have to be provided information to determine if they are competent. Okay. We have to offer assessment. We have to offer transport. All that stuff has to be made. And then, they have to have the mental capacity. If they have suicidal ideations, or if they've acted upon those suicidal ideations, remember they cannot refuse because they're deemed mentally incompetent at that point. They're not competent to make decisions for themselves. Okay. All right. HIPAA and EMTALA. So these are a couple very specific laws that are important for us to know. HIPAA is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And we've discussed this already earlier in the course when we talked about clinicals and all that kind of stuff. But just remember, HIPAA is all about not sharing patients' personal information, okay, or details about their care. It's all about the details, right? You can talk about patients in a general manner. sorry, you can talk about patients in a general manner, but you cannot discuss details that will help someone to identify who you're talking about, right? And specifically, you cannot discuss those details to someone that's not involved in their care. Okay. If I'm talking with the nurse and I'm transferring care over to the nurse or the attending physician, or maybe it's the cardiac doc, the cardiologist that comes down because I have a patient who has chest pain, and they're in the room and they're listening and they're getting information. Well, they're involved in their care. So I can talk to them, right? But if you have someone who is not involved in their care, then we're not discussing those details. Now, EMTALA stands for the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. These are federal regulations that ensure access to emergency care regardless of a patient's ability to pay. Okay, so EMTALA kind of deals more with hospitals, but I think of it this way. When someone calls 911 and we get on the scene, do we ask for a payment up front before we help them? No. That's what EMTALA is. Okay. That's basically saying, regardless of this patient's ability to pay, we're going to care for you. And that's how it is. Okay. I'm going to provide emergency care to you regardless of your ability to pay. Now, for hospitals, you have some that are county hospitals, some that are private hospitals and things like that. A hospital still has to provide emergency and life-saving care. Again, it doesn't matter if this person is homeless. It doesn't matter if this person has no finances, whatever, whatsoever. They still have to provide life-saving care. All right. Now, anything after that can be discussed at a later time, but that life-saving care, emergency care, it still needs to be provided. When we're talking about transferring a patient from one hospital to another, EMTALA also deals with the hospital. The transferring hospital has to stabilize that patient. So like I said, they have to provide, those life-saving measures to stabilize the patient before transferring care to EMS. And the EMS that they call must be qualified to assume care of that patient. So if you have someone who's on a ventilator and multiple drips and all this kind of stuff, multiple medications, and needs a critical care paramedic, then they can't call a BLS crew with 2 EMTs to transfer the patient from their hospital to a different hospital for, additional care, because those EMTs, unfortunately, they don't have the qualifications, certification, or training to care for that patient. So EMTALA is all about, it doesn't matter what's going on with the patient as far as finances are concerned. They will receive emergency care. Okay? They will receive emergency care. What are the signs of obvious death? So I've had a couple of you guys ask some questions in class throughout the semester, throughout this course about, especially, about cardiac arrest. Is there at any time that we would stop doing resuscitative measures? And the answer is no, not as an EMT. Okay. So as an EMT, once you start care, once you're doing those, you're doing those compressions and all that kind of stuff, you will continue to provide that care until you get to a hospital and a physician makes the decision on whether or not they continue the care or terminate those resuscitative efforts. Okay. There's only one time and one time only when you would stop delivering care. And that's if you were already, doing compressions and all that stuff, and then someone arrives on your scene with a valid DNR. You would review the DNR, and then you would halt any further resuscitative measures. Okay, that's the only time. But every other time, we're transporting for a physician, to make that decision. But there are times when we don't even start resuscitative measures at all, and that's because the patient is past help, if you will. Okay. And so these are the signs of obvious death. We've got a couple very specific ones, pretty easy. Obviously if your patient is decapitated, then that's a sign incompatible with life, right? If your patient is in any stage of decomposition, then we're not going to be doing anything, right? If your patient is rigor, right, or has rigor, And remember, rigor is where their muscles have stiffened. Okay. If they're stiff, then we're not gonna attempt resuscitation, because the person is past being able to help them, past being able to be resuscitated. And then if your patient also has what's called dependent lividity. So dependent lividity is where the blood has settled, or the blood has pooled in the lowest parts of your body. Okay. So for example, if you have a patient who goes into cardiac arrest when they're lying supine, and no one's there to do compressions, the blood stops circulating and they lie there for a while. Well, if the blood stops circulating, then it starts to settle, and it settles, and it's just gravity, right? So if they're laying supine, then you're going to see signs of lividity on their back and on their posterior side. And those signs of lividity is going to be kind of like this dark purplish color to their skin, where the blood has pooled. So let me see if I can grab you a picture of how dependent lividity real quick, okay? And of course, these are actually, this is a really good, it's not an actual picture of a patient, but it talks about, it's this bluish purple discoloration of the skin because the blood pools at the lowest point. So this is a person's back, okay? This is their upper back going down to their waist, and then this is their buttocks, okay? So if you notice this white where it says blanching, it's because that's where the back was like against the floor if they were lying supine. So you see the blood pooled in all these other places, except these places that specifically were caused by pressure. Okay. And it kind of gives you a little bit of a timeline here. Lividity begins, after about 30 minutes or so. And then we've got, the blood becomes fixed, right? So lividity, it's gonna start pooling within about 30 minutes. This is kind of interesting. Kind of helps you with time of death, cause of death, and all of that. That doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is if they have lividity, then we do not start resuscitative measures. Okay, then we don't. So let me. I don't know what I'm going to show here, but let's look at this one. Okay, there we go. This is actually a great picture. Okay, so this is a patient's back. They were lying supine when they passed, and all of that is the blood pooling. This is where the pressure of the patient's back was against the floor or whatever surface that they were lying on, same as the top of their posterior, right? So if you see that on your patient, then that's a sign incompatible with life. Okay, let's look at this one real quick and just see. Same thing. Do you see that? Now, this deals with what position your patient was in when they went into cardiac arrest. Okay, so if your patient was lying prone, which is face down, then you're going to see the lividity on their anterior part, right? On the part that is against the floor, which is the anterior aspect of them, not the posterior aspect of them if they were lying supine. I've had some patients that I've responded to, and they were in cardiac arrest sitting in a chair. Well, if you think about gravity, where am I going to see that lividity? I'm going to see that lividity, that pool, that blood that's pooled. I'm going to see it underneath their upper legs, right? So like their thighs, the backs of their thighs, and I might see it kind of close down to their ankles, right? But I don't see it in their back because they're not lying supine; they're sitting up. So you have to think about how gravity is. Okay, so that is definitely a sign of an obvious death. Okay, so decapitation, decomposition, rigor when your patient is stiff, dependent lividity, and then there is another one it's a little bit subjective, but we say just any injury that's incompatible with life. Okay, so maybe let's say you have a patient with a GSW to the chest. Okay, a single GSW to the chest, and it's kind of, maybe it's in the central chest. Okay. Well, can you 100% say that that one GSW makes this person beyond my help? Probably not. But if they had multiple GSWs, maybe it's, in the same area, maybe it's to the point where you actually can see that there's tissue damage inside, right? Then maybe that would be a little bit more along the lines of injuries incompatible with life. If your patient has had a head injury and there's brain matter visible, that right there, brain matter visible, injuries incompatible with life. If your patient is unconscious, pulseless, unconscious, apneic, all that stuff, and you've got brain matter showing, that's incompatible with life. But basically, the reason why we say it's subjective is basically everybody on that scene, all of the responders on that scene have to be in agreement that, yes, this person is beyond our help in order for you guys to, agree upon that. So just things to think about, okay? Because when you get there and your patient is pulseless, apneic, and unconscious, you have to do a quick assessment and just to make sure that they don't have any of those signs of obvious death. If they don't have any of those signs, then you start working them, right? You start your compressions, you do your stuff. But you want to assess your patient appropriately. Let's talk about crime scenes real quick. This is the last one on here. What is the role of EMS at crime scenes? Well, just remember the scene must be safe, okay? So make sure it's safe for you. Your priority is the emergency care of the patient, okay? We do try to not disturb the scene, touch only what you have to. Maybe if you have one ingress and egress, right? One way in and one way out, so you're not spreading evidence around, right? We try to preserve that evidence. If it's a patient who they're in cardiac arrest and we are not going to attempt resuscitation because they have obvious signs of death, then one person, you guys go in, keep it simple, do a quick assessment, and then go. Right? And you talk to law enforcement. You do not disturb that scene. We try to disturb it as least as possible. Okay. We also want to preserve evidence. So if you do have a patient who, is alive that you're treating, right? We're delivering that emergency care to that patient, but we do try to preserve evidence. So there's some very specific things like if you did have a patient with a GSW, if you're using your trauma shears to cut off their clothes because we need to access, we need to see them and do a quick and rapid trauma exam, then we want to make sure that when we're cutting through their clothes that we don't cut through where the hole in the clothing is from the bullet, right? We want to make sure that we preserve that so it can be, studied and looked at, for evidence. So we normally try to cut like along the seams and stuff like that to preserve that article of clothing. Other things where I used to work, we would carry paper bags on our ambulance, and we had paper bags because if your patient had any kind of possible evidence on their hands, maybe it was an assault or something, and the person fought back, and so maybe they had like things underneath their fingernails or DNA or something like that, that would be needed for this case, then we would put their hands in paper bags and, kind of tape around the wrist, but we would put their hands in paper bags to preserve that evidence. Okay. Or if maybe you have someone who shot someone else, right? And possibly shot someone else. Maybe there's, gunshot residue on their hands. Again, paper bag, that's what we would do. And we would use paper over plastic because plastic could allow your patient to sweat and then it would erode the evidence. So there's some specific things that we try to do on a crime scene to help out and make sure that we're not disturbing it too much. And we got to do our thing, but you still need to be just cognizant of where you are. So that's your medical legal. Let's shift over. Let's come back over here and go to one of your other things. Okay. I'm getting to it. Okay. So let's look at ambulance operations. That'll be next. Okay. So ambulance operations. Now I know a lot of you guys are always asking, because every semester I have students ask, are we going to learn how to drive the ambulance? Are you going to teach us how to do that? And the answer is no, absolutely not. We don't teach you guys to do that, because that's going to be the responsibility of whatever agency hires you after you pass our class. Okay. There's different kinds of ambulances, there's different kinds of apparatus, and everybody has their own policies and rules and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And they're going to teach you and train you all that kind of stuff. They're going to send you through what's called an EVOC course, EVOC. It's an emergency vehicle operators course. Okay. But what you do need to be aware of is just some things to think about when you are operating an ambulance, or just the operations of being in an ambulance, okay, whether you're driving or not. So number one, where do most EMS involved accidents occur? Well, one of the big ones is intersections. If someone is driving, if we're driving the ambulance and we are headed to a call, or maybe we're headed to a hospital, right? But if we've got lights and sirens going, then that means when we turn on those lights and sirens, it's a request for other drivers to yield to us, right? And that's all it is. It's a request for other drivers to yield. Okay, it also allows us to proceed through red lights and through stop signs, but after you have stopped and deemed it safe to proceed into the intersection. Okay. So, unfortunately, intersections are pretty much one of the most, unsafe places, when we're driving with EMS. When you approach an intersection, hopefully you guys have kind of seen this on your clinicals, and hopefully they've driven appropriately. But, if it's a red light, then you stop. You don't just blow through it. You have to stop, because you have to allow the other motorists to see you and hear you and yield to you. So if you're crossing an intersection and you have, the traffic that's crossing in front of you, they have to stop in order for it to be safe for you to go through, right? And you have to do what we call clear every lane. So if there's 2 lanes coming from the left and 2 lanes coming from the right, then you have to be able, as the driver, you have to be able to see both lanes from the left and both lanes from the right, that they're either clear or stopped. If you can't see one of those lanes, like maybe there's a semi truck or a box truck or something like that blocking your view of the far lane, well, you're kind of taking a risk. So you inch forward and inch forward and inch forward until you can see that it's clear, and then you proceed through, right? But if it's a red light or a stop sign, you stop, you clear the intersection, you clear the lanes, make sure it's visibly clear, and go. One of the things that I always talk about in class is the way they make cars nowadays is they have that, you can't really hear a whole lot of outside noise. Okay. I mean, you see commercials all the time talking about, the newest car and how quiet it is, and, how it's got you insulated and you can't hear any sound from outside. Well, that can sometimes include emergency sirens, So let's say that you're just driving along. You're not doing anything you're not supposed to be doing. You've got the radio up, you're jamming to one of your tunes, and you're in a vehicle that is very well insulated. You cannot hear the emergency sirens, right? The emergency sounds from the ambulance. So now we have to go by sight, right? And unfortunately, there's a lot of distracted drivers around there, whether they're talking to someone else in the vehicle with them, looking at their phone, doing things they're not supposed to be doing, that kind of thing. Or they're just looking in the other direction, so they don't see you. So that's why you, as the driver, you have to drive with due regard, and you're basically doing defensive driving the entire time that you're behind the wheel of that ambulance. Okay. So you might have stopped at a red light and everything looks clear and everything's good, and then all of a sudden here comes someone and they just blow right through right in front of you. And if you wouldn't have been stopped, you would have been hit. And that's why intersections are the most unsafe places when you're driving. Now, traffic accidents in general, when we're working the scene, we're actually on the scene of a traffic accident and we're working the scene, taking care of patients, that is probably the other place that is the most unsafe. Okay. So when you're driving, I would say intersections, but just in general is working a traffic accident. And we'll talk about that in just a minute when we go into questions 2, 3, and things like that. Okay. When you are working on the highway. So number 2, what are the general rules of working on the highway? Safety, traffic, stuff like that. So the first one, you must have your safety vest. Okay, you must have it. You must have it, and you have to be wearing it. Okay, if it's still in the ambulance or it's still in the door of the ambulance and you're not wearing it, then it's not doing you any good. You have to have that high visibility vest on your person when you're out of the vehicle working a scene on the highway. Okay. I also don't want you to trust approaching traffic because unfortunately, accidents breed more accidents. Okay, because people get distracted, they start looking over here, they're not paying attention to the person in front of them, and they can cause another accident. Okay, so try not to turn your back on traffic if you can. If you have to, I get it, but just keep your head on a swivel and be situationally aware of the traffic that's around you. Another one, the first arriving emergency vehicle is the block. They are the barrier. Okay, and that kind of goes into question number 3. But the first arriving emergency vehicle, whether it's a fire apparatus or an ambulance, it doesn't matter. They are the block. Okay, and we'll talk about that more with question 3. Also, if it's nighttime, then a lot of the ambulances have they're called floodlights or scene lights. And they're very bright lights on the sides and sometimes the front of the ambulance that you can turn on to help illuminate the scene at night, so you can see what you're doing a little bit better. Okay, but you got to make sure that's not you're parked in a way and you have those lights on only on the sides that's illuminating your scene, and it's not blinding the traffic that's trying to drive by. Okay, so just a couple rules about that. Now, number 3, which vehicle is responsible for blocking the accident when initially arriving on scene? So we already talked about this, but this is the first arriving vehicle. They're going to create a barrier between the accident scene and traffic. So let me pull up a visual for you, okay? So let's see here. Parking on scene. Emergency. Parking on scene of MVA. Let me just see if this pulls up what I'm looking for. Where is that? It's a diagram I've used before. I always forget what I need to write in here. So, parking of emergency vehicles. All right, this will work. This is perfect. Excellent. This is what I want. Okay. So there's a couple terms on here, and it's really important to pay attention to these terms. First off, right here, it calls the activity area. I call it the action area. Either way, this is your scene, okay? This is where the wreck has occurred. Now, on this diagram, the traveling traffic is going from left to right. So it's traveling from left to right, okay? And so from the scene where traffic is coming from, that's called upstream. Where traffic is headed is called downstream. Think about a river. That's really, just think about a river, okay? If you throw a stick into the river and it goes in the direction of travel, it's going to go downstream, okay? But if your friend is way up here, then that's upstream from where you are, okay? So it's always based upon the direction of travel. So your action area is right here. Now this is where your first block will be. Okay, now this shows the fire apparatus is there, so that's fantastic. So let's say the fire got there first, okay? So they're gonna come in here and they're gonna park at an angle actually, and it's going to block the, let's see if there, this is good. I wish I could turn it. What about this one? Nope. We're just going to go back to this and then okay. So they park at an angle in order to block not only this lane, but they try to block another lane as well. And they're going to park at an angle and create the first barrier. Okay. Now, if EMS arrived on scene first, they would do the same thing. Obviously, an ambulance is not as big as a fire truck. So, but they're still going to park at an angle and create a barrier. Okay. The second arriving apparatus, if it's a fire truck, if your first one is right here, your second arriving is going to be back here. And it's going to, I don't know, it's going to be like at least 100 feet, if I remember. You don't need to know that, but it's going to be back a little bit and create a second barrier, okay? And help to do what's called this transition area to get people to start moving over and going into different lanes so this stays clear for us. When EMS arrives, if EMS arrives later or after fire has already created a block, then they're going to go downstream of the incident, right? Downstream and park there. They're going to park in a way that their back doors are angled away from traffic, because when you open those back doors, you have an 8-foot stretcher that you have to get out, right? If these guys just came in and nosed in and their nose is here and the back of their door is back here, they open the doors and they're unloading the stretcher in traffic. So we don't want that. So they're going to come downstream and kind of park at an angle to where their nose is here and back doors are away from traffic. So it's safe to unload your stretcher, load your patient, and do all that kind of stuff, okay? So just make sure you kind of understand that. The first arriving vehicle always creates the barrier. If EMS is first, they create the barrier. Fire that arrives on scene will create the second. If fire is first, they create the first block. Second apparatus comes here. EMS is downstream, in front, downstream, okay? And then the cops, they'll arrive as well, and they'll, help to set out cones and flares and all that kind of stuff. And it's very possible that they may even be further upstream, helping to get people funneled into, different lanes to just keep traffic moving. Okay. Okay. So that's important to know. All right. Let's see here. I wish I could turn this. I wonder if I can. Is there pictures? Hang on. I'm looking. Nope, I can't turn it. Oh, I can. Yes, perfect. Aha. Sorry. Technology, yay. All right. So same thing, right? Same picture, but it just shows you that they're kind of at angles. So that helps. And you can see the different buffers and all that kind of stuff. Again, here's your action area or your scene. The flow of traffic is from the left to the right. So from the scene, that way is considered downstream. Up towards the left in the direction where the other traffic is coming from is upstream. And you've got your first apparatus. You see how they're kind of at an angle. And then you have a second apparatus and they're creating the block. And you see how your ambulance is at an angle as well, with the nose out here and the back of the doors away from traffic. That's perfect. That's what you want to see. Okay. All right, cool. Excellent. So that answers number 3. Number 4, what are some factors that might help you to choose air medical? So air medical is when we fly people, right? But I want you to kind of keep some things in mind. Sometimes flying a patient by helicopter is not the fastest way. Okay, it just kind of depends. So there are just a couple factors that help us make that decision. The first thing is, where are you? Where's your location in relation to the hospital that you're going to, right? we utilize helicopters a lot more in rural areas, where we're a lot further out from the metroplex or our hospital locations. And so of course it will be quicker to go by helicopter, right? That just makes sense, right? If we're trying to get to a distant hospital and my patient is critical, then a helicopter is a fantastic utilization, right? If there is prolonged extrication with a high priority or critical patient, then you may want to, and maybe you can't get them out of the vehicle, and you're just sitting on scene and sitting on scene and sitting on scene while the fire department works to get this guy out. They may run into challenges to where the extrication is prolonged a little bit longer than what they initially thought. You just never know, right? So you may call for a helicopter to land on your scene. That way, as soon as this person is truly extricated from the vehicle and out, we can load them into the helicopter and they can go, right? If it's a time kind of critical thing, right? Sometimes we utilize them if we need specialized equipment or specialized skills. If you do have ALS on your scene, though, if you do have paramedic level, providers on your scene, then they should be able to provide everything that patient needs. Okay, and just get them to the closest facility. Remote areas, of course, is going to be one of the main reasons. But what if ground transport is blocked? Okay, what if, and this has happened a couple times, maybe we have patients that we needed to get to Fort Worth, and because remember, I work over here in Tarrant County. So if you have patients that we need to get over to some of our big hospitals in Fort Worth, but the roads are blocked. Okay, maybe it's blocked by weather like flooding. That does happen. Okay, and ground transportation cannot physically get them from point A to point B. Then you can call for a helicopter, right? But I do need for you to understand a couple things about flying, about air medical transport. If the weather is bad, they don't fly. Okay, because that's a safety issue for them. If the ceiling is low, and they talk about the ceiling, that's the clouds. If there's low-lying clouds, they don't fly. It has to be safe for them as well. It wouldn't make any sense for them to put their safety at risk, to take a patient from point A to point B, because it's not going to be safe for the patient either. It's not going to be safe for anybody. So it has to be safe for them. What if it's icing outside, and it does happen like that sometimes here in Texas. And so it ices, and you need to take your patient, to Big Baylor or Medical City Plano or something like that. And you're 20 minutes away on a regular day. If it's icing and you can only go like 10 miles per hour, 15 at that, then it's going to take you a long time to get there. So you may need to call for a helicopter, right? So it's just kind of thinking about what resources you have, thinking about the pathway you're going to take. What's the ground transport time going to be like versus air? What's the is your patient critical? Are they stable? What's going on? There's a lot of different factors to think about. But if you do decide to utilize a helicopter, then do it. But you also have to now create a landing zone for that helicopter. And the fire department is most likely going to be doing this while you are taking care of your patient, right? But there's a couple of things about an LZ that you kind of need to know about, right? The LZ. Let's see here. When you're setting up your landing zone, okay, this area, and this is where we want the helicopter to land, right? It needs to be flat, obviously, or flat is preferred. It needs to be clear of obstructions, free of debris, and at least 150 feet from the collision or accident scene. Okay, it needs to be a little bit distance away in an open area that's flat and free of debris. Because if you've ever been around a helicopter when they land or take off, the just the wind coming off those blades, those rotor blades, it's a lot, right? So we don't want it to be unsafe for people to be around. If it is on the highway, and sometimes we've landed helicopters on the highway. If it's on the highway, then traffic is stopped both ways. Okay, and the law enforcement will absolutely help you with that. They'll funnel traffic off, at exits kind of upstream from the incident to make sure that everybody is off the highway on both sides if we're landing a helicopter, okay? You must mark each corner of the LZ. So an LZ is going to be a square-shaped area. You have to mark each corner. And then you place a 5th warning device on the upwind side, okay? Because wind direction is just absolutely critical when we're talking about flying, okay? So during the daytime, the minimum size of your landing zone needs to and this is minimum, needs to be 60 by 60. 60 feet by 60 feet square. At night, the minimum is 100 feet by 100 feet. Now, I know your group quiz right now says 125, and that is incorrect, okay? It's 100 by 100. And when you're setting up your LZ, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a picture for you. So you have to have markers on all 4 corners. You have to have that 5th warning device on the upwind side, okay? So if you're looking at this, you've got this, which is, it's an open area, it's level ground, okay? Free of obstructions and overhead things, right? Overhead's over here. This is 100 by 100, and you've got it set up. Every corner is marked, and the wind direction on the upwind side is marked. Okay, so that pilot knows how to approach. Okay, I'm going to stop. Okay. So that's important. Now, number 5 on our little worksheet here, it says, how do you approach a helicopter when it's landed? Okay, well, let's look at it. Okay, first, you only approach when the medical crew tells you it's safe to do so, okay? Oops. If I can spell, how. There we go. Okay, so you only do it when it's safe to do so. And the crew will tell you that, okay? You never, ever, ever go by the tail, ever. You never go by the tail. So if you're taking a look at this, there's your tail rotor. Never approach from the tail. Okay, you always approach from the side. The side is going to be the best. Approach from the side, but only when the air medical staff tells you it's safe. And they're also going to tell you how to approach, okay? So you don't just walk up to them. You have to wait till they've landed, wait till they're stable, wait till the crew comes out and and talks to you and is looking at the patient. Y'all are discussing things, and then y'all will actually approach the helicopter together, okay? So you see the safety zones are from the side, okay? Acceptable kind of from the sides, right? The back, the tail rotor is an absolute no. When you're thinking about this, okay? When we talked about we want the ground to be flat, well, what if the ground isn't flat and you approach from the upside where, it's not safe, right? If the ground isn't level, the blades, you don't want to get on the side where the blades are close to the ground. You want to be on the downhill side and come at it from this way, right? Don't ever go to the rear of the aircraft, okay? Secure any loose belongings. So if you have your stethoscope around your neck, right, you might want to get that off your neck and put it in your pocket. If you have a hat on, if you have anything that's loose and those rotors are still going, those blades are still going, then that can become a flying object at that point, okay? But you really have to think about how you're approaching this. And I think that's the last one on here, but couple more things when you're driving that ambulance. And I know we don't teach you how to drive it, but just a couple things. The weather is going to affect how fast you go. Okay. I think sometimes people, when they turn those lights and sirens on, there's an actual, I can't remember the word for it, but there's an actual condition that happens when to emergency drivers when you turn the lights and sirens on, okay? And there's a little bit of adrenaline in there and all that kind of stuff, but you can't let that happen. You are constantly in a defensive driving status, basically, because other drivers, a lot of times they forget, right? They forget that they're supposed to yield to the right. Okay. Sometimes they slam on their brakes in front of you. Sometimes they yield to the left. Sometimes they cut you off. Sometimes they follow behind you to try to get through red lights. It's going to happen, right? But you need to always be looking around. And if you're the passenger, then you need to help that driver. Okay. Now let's say it's raining. Okay. First off, that ambulance probably weighs up to, if not pretty much around 12,000, 13,000 pounds. Okay. Which is a lot more than your personal vehicle. If you drive a big old truck, then it's a little bit different. You might have, a little bit more understanding of that. But if you drive a small sedan style car, then just be aware that ambulance weighs a lot more. And because of that, it takes a lot longer to stop. That's what I'm trying to get in here. Okay. So if it's raining, then the ambulance will require twice the stopping distance than on a dry day. And that's just on pavement. Okay. That's not on gravel or anything like that. Okay. So twice the distance, twice the stopping distance if it's raining. If it's sleeting or ice, then an ambulance will require 5 times the stopping distance. You can't just slam on your brakes. Okay. So it's all about defensive driving. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Making our way. Next one we're going to talk about is going to be the MCI and triage. Okay. And you guys will, if you haven't already, then we're going to be doing an MCI drill in class, and that will really kind of drive this stuff home for you. Okay. But let's talk about this. Okay. So what is START and why do we use it? Well, first off, let's talk about what an MCI is. An MCI stands for Mass Casualty Incident. And an MCI, the best and most general definition of it is when the number of patients outweighs the resources that you have. Okay. So that means that we have to start triaging. We have to decide, who do I treat first? Okay. And the easiest way to do it is a very systematic approach that is utilized across the nation with START triage, START. START is simple triage and rapid transport. That's what it stands for. Okay. So what is it? It's a triage algorithm that we use during patient scenarios where, again, the number of patients outweigh the resources. So an MCI, we will assess one patient at a time. It's a step-by-step approach. Okay. This is the initial assessment and treatment of each patient done in 30 seconds, where we only correct life threats and move on to the next one. Okay. So let's pull up the START algorithm. Let's pull that up. Okay, so the START algorithm, this is probably one of the best ones here. All right. So again, simple triage and rapid transport. We're going to be going through different colors. You have green, yellow, red, and black. Okay, and you'll tag your patients one of those colors, and they stand for different things. Okay, and if we were actually looking at our page here, then, it talks about what types of patients are green, which ones are yellow, which ones are red, and which ones are black. So we're basically going to be talking about these questions when we're going through this algorithm. Okay, so let's take a look at this algorithm. Okay. So the green is considered minor. Your minor patients, we call those the walking wounded. Okay. These guys, if they're mobile, they're green. Okay. Now, one of the first things that you do when you come across, before you start going to individual patients, is you walk into the scene and you yell out and you shout, EMS, if you can hear me, you can hear my voice, walk towards me, come towards me. And anyone who can is considered green. Okay. Because that means they can understand what you're saying and they can physically get to you. That's our walking wounded. But you have to kind of shout that out and say that in the beginning. And whoever cannot get to you, Then we go one by one and start to triage them. Okay. So the walking wounded, these are the guys who can come to you after you've called out and asked, if you can come to me, if you can hear my voice, come to me. Those are your walking wounded. Those are your green. Then you start assessing your patients one by one. Okay. Another acronym that we use is RPM. Respirations, perfusion, and mental status. Okay, so RPM. Okay. So you get to your first patient, okay? And respirations, perfusion, mental status, RPM. So the first thing, are they breathing? Yes or no? Super simple. If the answer is no, then you have one opportunity to position their airway, okay? Let me see if I can actually pull this into a bigger picture for you. There we go. Got one opportunity to position their airway. And if they have spontaneous respirations after you position their airway, if now they are breathing, then they're tagged a red, which is considered immediate, your most critical patients, and you move on to the next one. Okay, remember 30 seconds per patient. We're not bagging them. We're not doing it. We're not doing compressions. We're not doing anything like that. Okay, we've simply repositioned their airway, and if they start to spontaneously breathe, then they're tagged a red. Unfortunately, if your patient does not have respirations and after you reposition their airway, they still are not breathing, then they are tagged a black, which is expectant or deceased, and then you move on. Okay? If your patient is spontaneously breathing when you first get to them, then it's pretty simple. They're either breathing more than 30 times a minute or less than 30 times a minute, okay? That's your determining number. So if it's over 30 times a minute, which is, 30 is going to be once every 2 seconds, right? And you can kind of estimate that. If it's more than 30 times a minute, then they're tagged a red and you move on. You don't even have to get to perfusion or mental status, okay? Because that's your decision right there, okay? They're breathing spontaneously, yes, at a rate over 30 a minute, tagged red, move on to the next patient. If they're breathing under 30 times a minute, then that's better. So now I'm going to move on to my second assessment, and that's perfusion, okay? Look at this, 32 can do. That's actually pretty cool. So I'm going to move on to perfusion, okay? And I can do a couple of things here. I can either look at their radial pulse or look at their cap refill. Either one is good, okay? If I feel their radial pulse and their radial pulse is present, excellent. I'm going to move over to mental status. If their pulses are not present, then I can do any kind of life control, life-threatening bleeding control, right, with my tourniquets. Quick things, tag them a red, and move on. If I choose to look at cap refill, then that's okay too. And if their cap refill is over 2 seconds and they have life-threatening bleeding, do that bleeding control with a tourniquet, tag them a red, and move on. If their cap refill is good under 2 seconds, then that means their perfusion is good and I can move on to my next assessment, which is mental status. Okay, now mental status is can they follow simple commands? Simple commands, easy. Can you touch your nose for me? Can you blink twice? Simple commands, okay? We don't want to be asking patients to say the alphabet backwards every third letter or something like that. Super simple commands. If they can follow commands, then this is the only time that they are actually going to be triaged a yellow or delayed, okay? And that means that everything else is good because we've gone through respirations. The respirations were good under 30 minutes. We've gone through perfusion. They've got good, they've got radial pulses or cap refill is under 2 seconds. So they've got good perfusion and they have good mental status. So they're yellow. Basically, this person is not critical, but they had something keeping them from being a walking wounded, from being the green. They can understand you and they could probably get to you if they could. A lot of times this is going to be someone who maybe is trapped underneath some rubble or something like that. Or maybe they have, their leg is broken and so they physically cannot get to you, but they're still stable and they're considered delayed. Now, if that mental status, if you get all the way down here, respirations are good, perfusion is good, but their mental status is not, then they're tagged a red. Okay, so all along the way, all of our stops along the way, respirations, if there's a problem with respirations, they're a red. If there's a problem with perfusion, they're a red. If there's a problem with mental status, they're a red. Okay, but once I tag them, I don't have to assess the remaining stuff. Okay, so when we say should take less than 30 seconds, that is an absolute. Okay, absolute, less than 30 seconds. So make sure you have a pretty good handle on that triage algorithm. We're actually going to be using it when we do our MCI drill in class. Okay. All right, RPMs, respirations, perfusion, mental status. That's the order in which we assess. When do we tag them? Okay, well, you're going to have what's called the primary triage, and that's when you guys are doing what we just did, going through that algorithm. You're in the scene, you're going from patient to patient, and you're going to tag them that primary triage, that initial triage done in the field. There will be a secondary triage that occurs, and that's when the patients are actually brought out of the scene and into the treatment area. So the treatment officer who is receiving the patients is now going to triage them again, because it's very possible that while they were, just laying there in the scene, waiting for the triage to finish and waiting for someone to come actually get them and move them out, maybe they deteriorated. Now, maybe they're no longer a yellow. Maybe they're a red, right? Or vice versa. Okay. It's pretty rare for a red to become a yellow, but it might happen. Okay, maybe when you put that tourniquet on them, they, and they're no longer losing blood. Maybe now their respirations are better and their perfusion a little bit better and things like that, right? But there's a primary triage when they are categorized and triaged in the field, and a secondary triage when they're brought to treatment. How long do we spend? 30 seconds. Okay, 30 seconds. That's your MCI and your triage. Okay. All right, let's go over our last one, which is the hazmat. We're going to go over hazmat stuff. And then that'll be it for this mod 5. And then I'm going to do a separate final exam review, and I'll pull up that final exam review document that's right here. I'll pull this up and do that separate, okay? Because it's a little bit of everything. But I wanted to go over these because these are very, very specific to your Module 5 information. Okay. And remember, all of our module exams have been, what's the word? Cumulative, right? All of our exams, module exams have been cumulative. So that also means that Mod 5 is cumulative of everything that we've done over the semester. You still only have a 50-question test, but it can cover anything. Of course, with the core content of it being this operation stuff. So let's talk about hazmat real quick, okay? Hazmat or hazardous materials, you have some different things, right? You have some different basic